Hi, this is Craig Luck, screenwriter of Finch, and you're listening to Monday Morning Critic Podcast.
In the Wild West world of podcasting, there is one podcast that is authentic and genuine and continues to stand tall in its originality. Based on a passion for his guests, their work, and his love of podcasting, Derek Thomas and Monday Morning Critic Podcast get amazing, diverse, unique guests found nowhere else. The variety and quality are endless. There is something for everyone. Derek Thomas is the hero you deserve. He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector. Welcome to Monday Morning Critic Podcast. Here is Derek Thomas.
It all happened so fast. There was a solar flare. Goodbye crops and food, goodbye everything. So I hid. Frightened and so alone. And I found you. What shall we have? Get your elbows off the table. Get your elbows off the table. All right, you're next. You see, I'm developing something interesting. Giant leap of faith. Now, if you can speak, tell me something about you.
That robots must protect dog.
Warning.
If we don't go before that storm hits, we'll die, all of us. As soon as you can walk, we're leaving.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1.
That's falling.
1, 2.
Head west, over the mountains.
Would you like me to drive?
Don't oversteer. That's oversteering.
Sorry.
Ease your foot up just a hair. Perfect. Hey, what's all the fuss?
I learned to talk dog. I don't think it likes me. Come and see this.
Tie the RV down. Hang on to something. We should be safe once we get into the mountains. Other things will happen, like 150-degree heat, UV radiation, and people hiding in the shadows. Go now!
Do you think we'll make it?
Not without my team. What we do together.
I believe in you, Finch.
I know you wanted to become, and I was reading this on IMDb, you wanted to become a pilot when you were young, right? So
Right.
where did the love of aviation come from at such a young age? Before we get into the writing and the other wonderful stuff that you've been a part of, where does that love of aviation come from?
I think that's a really good question. If I was to drill down into that, I suppose it's because I was very lucky as a kid growing up that my parents were very adventurous and they would want to go traveling and see the world, as Finch actually says in the movie. And through that, I suppose that being on a plane or planes plural was my first introduction to escapism. And I think as any small kid would, sort of marveled at the feat of engineering that is aviation and planes. And then I can't remember at what point, but at some point in my childhood, it became a reality, I suppose, that is a potential career to follow, and that is something that you can do in life and you can earn from. And when that sank in, I suppose the idea of that, the lure and magic of that became something I just couldn't ignore. And it, for a long time, many years, that was my aspiration, was to be a pilot, and more specifically a commercial pilot, which is probably like the most exciting version of a pilot that you could possibly imagine. And most pilots don't go in aiming to necessarily be a commercial pilot. Some go in to be, want to fly a fighter jet or something. But no, there was just something so interesting in that. And then it was when I think I became of an age when I realized just how important that job is in terms of the safety of your passengers and everything else. When that dawned on me, then I sort of started shaking my boots and thought, maybe I shouldn't do that. I don't know. And it completely derailed everything for me. And it's funny because obviously I pursued other things in the meantime, but it's funny because now I've reached a point in my life where I've been able to afford a private pilot's license. So that's been, even though I haven't quite got the license yet because I'm in the US right now, and I was doing all of my training and everything in the UK. So it's one of those things that I just had to press pause on, but I've got all my hours and I'm ready to just take the test. I've done all the ground exams, everything.
So Craig, you haven't given up on this. You're still at it.
No, it's, if anything, it's come full circle.
Wow.
Wow. I don't get me wrong. I'm not going into it for, as a career. Certainly not ever thinking about flying an Airbus or a Boeing, but it just the idea of being able to take myself up into the skies is still one of those dreams that I've always held very near and dear. So, the first opportunity I got was, right, let's go. Let's see if I've actually got it, and I put myself through flying school as well. So.
Wow, that's fantastic. I mean, you hear about like actors that do, right? Travolta is supposedly a fantastic pilot. And then you hear Harrison Ford, maybe not so much, but it's,
it's funny. I knew his assistant. Obviously one of the other jobs that I did between everything else was working on sets for a number of years. Yep. In fact, that was kind of not to jump ahead, but that was almost like my real film school,
Yep. Yep.
That was the way I really sort of cut my teeth in terms of, okay, this is how everything is run. And one of the joys is obviously meeting several walks of life who are on film sets. And one of those was Harrison's PA from the Star Wars movies. And Harrison would always take him up, even though he was a nervous flyer in himself. So he had many stories about going up with Harrison in a small fixed wing plane.
And when people think pilot, right? At least when I do, I mean, like I think when you were a kid, you think like the last 5 or 10 minutes of Dunkirk with Tom Hardy and this heroic, right? That's kind of what sparks it for all of us. But that is so impressive that you still do it. I hope I pronounce where you were born correctly. Is it Plymouth, Devon, England? Am I saying that correctly?
That's correct. Yeah.
So have you lived in that part of England your entire life? Have you when you were in England, or did you kind of move around a little bit?
So I was born in Plymouth because my dad was in the Navy, and Plymouth was and still remains one of the biggest sort of naval ports in the UK. And then quite soon after that's kind of further southwest. We moved slightly further north to the Bristol region, Bristol and Somerset region, and that's sort of my memory of growing up is in that area. And that's when I went to school. Secondary school, as we call it, and then college. And then I went to film school, sort of my university level degrees in just outside of London in a county called Surrey.
Mm-hmm. And we talk about your love for aviation. Where does your love for storytelling come from, right? Is it a movie? Is it a book? Is it a writer? Is it a combination of all three? Because I have to feel like there has to be something that kind of sparks this, right? And it's probably a question you've been asked a trillion times, but
with stories, yeah, it's funny because it was always that my exposure to movies. My dad has always had this fascination with devices and things, and he would always acquire like the new VHS video recorder and things like that. And I was never one of those people that was I learned my filmmaking through my dad's camera. It's like that was out of bounds for me, But the important thing is he always acquired these things. Whether it was like one of those analog visual mixers that you would have to lace up to 2 VCRs, and you could do these very simple fades, and that was always a really interesting part of it for me because that was like my first behind this how it works behind the curtain, even from a home video standpoint. But it was really that sort of exposure to movies that lured me into the magic of cinema. And again, it never hit me that was a reality, that was something that could be pursued as a potential career. So I didn't for a very, very, very long time. And it was through that I suppose that eventually, as you become more and more aware of how movies are made, then you realize that, there are really these various stages. And at one point, long before the movie's actually made, you have to write something, and then it has to be prepared, and you go through all of these the three major stages of making a movie. But even still, like I full disclosure, never set out to become a screenwriter, and it was in my pursuit of being a director that it became clear that the only way in which to acquire a screenplay that you yourself, not a comment on the screenplay yourself, the screenplay itself, but more just you as a potential director, the only way to acquire a screenplay that you feel like is worthy of you making and putting probably your own money into, especially if it's a short film, your own blood, sweat, and tears, would be to write it yourself. Because who would give you a screenplay that, unless they were going to direct it themselves? That's just the way the short film part of the industry goes, I suppose, that most short films are created for a director to showcase their talents. And it was through that thinking that BIOS, as it was known at the time, which obviously has become Finch as a feature film, that's how it started.
And the big picture for you, though, starting off from what you're saying is the pursuit of being a director. Is that where the University of Creative Arts in the UK comes in, Craig? Was that your pursuit there? Am I putting things together correctly? Exactly
that, yeah. So I knew I wanted to get involved in filmmaking at secondary school. So, when I was 13, 14, 15, that sort of age. And we had quite a great curriculum. We had the opportunity to study what's colloquially known in the UK as media studies. Mm-hmm. But what I realized was that was quite a broad range of different types of media, whether it's radio or if it's TV, or if it's journalism. It's that early sort of exposure. Excuse me. And I kind of already knew that I wanted to get into film. So I didn't do media studies at school. And in fact, instead, what I did was, me and my best friend at the time, we would just write films together and then go out and make them together. And that was
that's great.
That was everything. We were just doing it as for the sheer joy. We'd love going out into the less trodden paths of the town and finding an old derelict building that would be like, oh, okay, we can stage this, crazy movie here, regardless of what it may be. And so I completely skipped over that at school and just did my own thing. And then when obviously we left secondary school and you're going into college, then everything obviously becomes even more sort of serious. And I went into college and did a BTEC National Diploma, it's known as, in film production. And coinciding with that, which was very, very physical, you really sort of, that was the course that you go and you actually go out and make stuff, whether it's you're shooting a documentary project, or you're going out and making a fiction film, or you're using the TV broadcast equipment in the college's TV studio part. And then coinciding with that, I had my A-level film studies, which was much more theory-based. None of that was practical. All of that was the written word and essays and the study of film from an academic level. So it was there that everything sort of galvanized in terms of like, okay, this is exactly what I want to do, is not only film, but I want to specialize in directing film as well. And that was let me get it right. That was a 3-year course, 2-year course. I can't. It was a while ago. It was 2 or 3 years, and then after that, that's when I went on to the UCA, or the University of Creative Arts, and it was through that was a 3-year course, and it was through that you get closer and closer to being able to specialize. And in your third and final year, you get to specialize in a particular area, and obviously, I chose directing, and the first 2 years of film school is very much, how to put it, you're very much following a very set path in terms of the curriculum. Like, this is the type of projects that we would like you to make. And you feel like you're proving your worth as a student, right? You're not finding yourself as a filmmaker or anything like that. It's, you're doing, it's a BA honors in film production. So you're there to earn a grade, and you graduate with that degree. But in the third and final year, whilst everything obviously comes to a real fine point, and you're doing a 10,000 word dissertation on whatever subject that you've chosen. As a side note, in my case, it was Stanley Kubrick. It was comparing 2001 and Eyes Wide Shut, sort of arguably the first and the last bigger movies that he had made in his film career. I thought it was very interesting because both are about an odyssey. Anyway, the third and final year, it was almost like I felt like you were let off the leash as far as what film school was up to that point. And I've sort of always maintained this idea of it's almost like the film school would like you to make sort of Mike Leigh movies. And as much as I love Mike Leigh, I don't want to be the next Mike Leigh. And so going into third year, it was like my first opportunity to be able to say, I can make a genre movie right now if I wanted to. I've literally got carte blanche on whatever I want to make. And it was in that place that I was in, which was, I was a little behind on my dissertation, which is depressing in itself. I had just finished reading Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Such a great...
By that point. Just finished reading that book, and The Family Dog of 15 Years we just had to say goodbye to, and I had to do everything over the phone because I was 300 miles away and I would never get back in time. And all of that in like a melting pot just said to me, I want to write a very sweet movie. And right now I feel like I want to make science fiction because that's so far removed from everything that we were doing at film school at that time. And my full intention was to make that short movie in my third and final year at film school. But it was by the time I'd finished the short screenplay, of which Finch was based on, I knew straight away that it was way too big for film school. This needed far more time than your end of year final major project could ever afford. And it needed even more money than that as well. In fact, at one point, I think I figured it needed about £100,000, which at the time was close to about $200,000. So obviously, as a film student who's already in mega debt, that it is pie in the sky stuff. So it ended up being that I didn't make the movie. In fact, the script and all the preparation work for the short movie was enough for me to have for my final major project. So Finch as a short script was what I submitted as my last project at film school before I graduated.
Wow. So I have so much to say about what you just said, but I'm going to put that on pause. I wanted to ask you one more question before we dive into BIOS and some really interesting stuff you just said. So just a fragment of your IMDb for those listening include Solo, a Star Wars movie, very underappreciated, Annihilation, Doctor Strange, Thor, Dark World. How much of that do you contribute to really your pursuit in becoming, I guess a director, but more so just your craft in itself, right? So I kind of know what you are, but those things were not related to writing. So, and I get that they're more, they're closer to directing, which now makes more sense. But what did you pick up along the way? How important were those things to you?
Very. Whether you're a writer or a director or a producer, and anyone working within the feature film space as a person above the line, typically the set that you work on is your set, right? It's your movie. And being someone who is part of the below the line crew, and in my particular case, I was part of the video department or the video and camera department, arguably. And it was in my exposure to that, being able to walk onto a Wachowski set, like his Jupiter Ascending and Sense8, or walking onto and working with Alex Garland on Annihilation, or even obviously Ron Howard when he came and took over the Solo movie, because I was there with Phil and Chris as well. All of that was really interesting because you don't typically get rewarded with that perspective of how these different sets are run, how people coordinate and orchestrate their sets and how they conduct themselves. So I remember speaking to a good friend of mine who has been very successful after film school, and he was saying that he was sort of envious of even though I hadn't at the time had reached the same success that he had, because he had gone straight into directing commercials. He was still quite envious because I was having this perspective on these different sets, and I was being able to sort of quietly observe how these directors especially were running the show. And all of that goes into a pot, whether it's how that scene is broken down, how it's shot, because one of the other rewards of working on movie sets as a technician is that I'm able, I at least always made myself able to read the script prior to shooting. So even though I was a mercenary, I was able to read these things, digest them, see them in my own head, how I would do it, and then go out and actually work on the movie and make these, and be a part of the very large team and crew to make these things come to life. And it was endlessly interesting because, you'd get to see how all of these amazing directors would put this together. And that taught me so much about writing too, the power of the written word, how much you can put into a screenplay in order to paint that picture in whoever's mind, that idea of how you can be so detailed that there is literally only almost one, maybe two ways to direct a scene, because it's almost like it's directed itself from the written word. So it certainly lent itself in that sense. And the way I found myself in the on-set experience, which, I lived my life by for about 6 years, that was certainly the way I kept my head above waters financially for all that time, was in the pursuit of making Bios Finch as a short movie after graduating. So for at least 18 to 24 months after graduating, that was almost like one of my main focuses. I want to get this short movie made. This is what I feel like is going to be my calling card. I don't want to let this opportunity and dream go. And so for a long time, for all that time, in fact, I made thousands of emails and phone calls on a monthly basis, I would say. And obviously for every 1,000 emails that you send out, only one would come back saying, yes, sure, this sounds great. And for a long time, I was pursuing production companies. That to me felt like the way to go. And before I went to production companies, I crewed the entire movie. I had an awesome DP. I had people in visual effects based in Soho, London, that offered to do all of the visual effects gratis. I had a special effects company that were more than happy to make the droid, as it was known at the time. Obviously, that character became Jeff, all for free as a physical animated puppet. All of these elements which made the idea of the short more and more undeniable, because it's always difficult to make a short film. How do you crowbar that much money out of someone when they will never see it back again? to me at the time, it was just making that idea of the short so interesting and so undeniable as an opportunity, because it had already been written, prepped, crewed, everything. We just needed the money, and then we could get up and running. And so I turned my aim onto production companies. That felt like that was the way to get that funding. And every production company that I went to pretty much said the same thing, which is, why don't you write this as a feature film? And at the time, thinking back on it right now, it's kind of funny, because the whole one of the reasons, outside of just wanting to write something that was very sweet natured and sort of almost like meant no harm, was also that I wanted to write a short film that had a very defined beginning, middle, and end, and it didn't want to be anything more than that. It felt like I certainly set out to write a short film that was perfectly suited to that medium and that format. And so the idea of stretching it out into a 2-hour movie, it was just like, okay, I've made a mistake there, because that goes against everything as to what I set out for. And then I did get close with some production companies. I got about half of the funding put together, but some of that was all hinged on that idea of, well, if we fund this, then we get the rights to the feature film. And then, you know, when you get that close, you do instinctively sort of take 2 steps backwards and take stock of the situation and think, this is a very important moment, and is this the right thing to do? And if it's not, then what else are you going to do? And you sort of have this moment of crisis, I suppose. But it was during all of this time, when I was trying to set up the movie, that the way I was, so between graduating in 2009, 2010, and me working on feature film sets, between that time, I was working as an Apple specialist in Bristol. So I was working at an Apple store. And it was during that time that I met Ivor Powell, who was obviously the line producer on films like Alien and Blade Runner, and who I obviously ended up co-writing the feature script with. And one of the I very specifically sought him out because I had discovered that some years prior, there had been a short science fiction film called The Dreamer that was made and funded and everything else for £100,000, and I wanted to know how he did it, because it was almost the exact same thing that I was trying to do, right? Short science fiction film for that same amount of money. And the person that had directed that film was a guy called Miguel Sapochnik, and I had reached out to him. I had found him in 2007, my first year of film school, and I found him through just reading screenplays all the time. That's all I obviously still do, but at the time, that was my film school in the evenings as well, was just going back and reading feature film scripts, whatever script that I could get a hold of. And I had read the script for his movie that he was making at the time, that ended up being a film called Repo Men. And I loved the concept. Love that idea that, you know, you've got artificial organs, and if you don't keep up the ridiculous payment scheme, then someone come around to your house and repossess it. You know, darkly grim, and I loved that. And I looked at who was directing it, as I often did, go straight onto IMDb, and there was his name, and I thought, oh, I've not heard this name before. And for good for me, I'd found his Facebook account, and just reached out to him on there, and just had a very brief back and forwards. And then skip forward 2 years after I'd written Finch as a short film, I had sort of looped back to him, and he became like almost like a godfather to it. He was giving me lots of advice and commenting on different things. And it was, you know, it was wonderful for me to have a director who had gone out and made his first feature and cut his teeth that way as a guiding light through this. And then when I discovered that obviously Ivor had funded that short film that got him his feature career, and I obviously wanted to know how he did it. And unfortunately for me, that money came out of his own pocket, and that wasn't something that he was willing to rush back into ever again. It was literally, it was something that he had done at the time because it was furthering both of their careers, and not something that he was looking to repeat. However, in the first conversation that I had with Ivor on the phone after he had read the short script, was that he did want to be involved, but not necessarily as a producer, because he knew what was necessary from a producer on a short film level. And that means being in the trenches every day, often fighting for the smallest of things when really it should be about the filmmaking process. So he basically turned around to me and said, whatever you want to do with this, it's completely up to you, but I don't think I'm going to be the producer to get you the funding. However, it was through the friendship that I inevitably developed with him that we obviously ended up talking about this more and more and more, to the point that one day we sort of took 2 steps back and said, hold on, are we writing this together? Are we writing this as a feature film together? And all of that obviously came back to that same point of, well, how do we do this? Because I had obviously had endless conversations with him about how this was originally a short script that I just wrote for the short medium and nothing else. So how do we make this into a feature? I've just realized my daughter's crying next door. I'm so sorry if you can hear.
No, I have a daughter upstairs too. Hey, I get it. You might hear some dogs barking in my house. No big deal.
I'm a fan of dogs.
Yes, Craig. So before you go on, let me just ask you a few things. First, I have to comment on the video work in Solo, or Star Wars story, which has, without question, the most powerful Star Wars scene that I've ever seen, and I would say I'm a relatively big fan. When young Lando introduces Solo to the Millennium Falcon, and John Powell's score is pumping through, that is one of the best moments.
Right.
But anyways, I don't want to get too off track. So about BIOS. So I want to talk about BIOS. You've been talking about it, and you're following the path, and you're saying it much more effectively than I could have. But getting back to something you said earlier, right? So you read the book, The Road. Did you also see the movie too? Did you have a chance? Because I talk about this often, and it's one of my all-time favorites. So what were your thoughts just on the book and the movie? What resonated about that to you? Where did you find, how does that hit you? Like, how do you absorb that? Because it's really, The Road, I've recommended it to a lot of people. Many find it very depressing. I think it's just beautiful, for lack of a better word. What about that, the book or the movie, hits you hardest?
Very good question. Obviously the immediate thing you take from it is just its savagery, I suppose, not in terms of just the violence, but just the humanity of it. It takes zero prisoners in its depiction of life after an extinction level event. And at the time, I certainly hadn't read anything, and certainly after I'd seen the film, seen anything like that as well, which was just this very brutal depiction of the reality of the end of the world. But all of that to say, obviously, it wasn't a film that I came out of saying, I can't wait to watch that again, and or read that again. And in fact, as far as I recall, and I've only read the book once and I've only seen the film once, and that was at the cinemas. And if I recall correctly, there was only one scene that was omitted from the book to the movie, and it was that infamous scene of them stumbling across, Vigo and his son stumbling across these people that for the first time have fled from them instead of them running toward, trying to chase them.
Right.
They realize why. And, it's that horrible scene. And it was so unflinching that I really, it was amazing because it just made the reality of a post-apocalypse more real than I'd ever seen or read before. And I suppose it was that and the combination of losing the family dog that I sort of somehow put those two things together and thought, well, what if I was at the end of the world? And then obviously, well, I would be lonely, but then I'd want a companion, and that maybe that companion's a dog. But what if I needed, and it snowballed from there. It was kind of funny how those elements came together, but it was that unflinching reality of the road, which is what I think made me very interested in post-apocalypses. Certainly of that time. And I was playing a lot of video games around that time. I remember I was playing Fallout 3, which is obviously, I still consider one of the best games I've ever played. And that takes place in a very expansive post-apocalyptic world as well. So my head was filled with the end of the world at the time. But in an effort to keep, film, at least from my perspective, that escapist medium, that's why I came up with that idea of, well, does the end of the world mean that it also has to be a very depressing and dark story, or could it be something else, and so that idea of just a man wanting to prolong the life of his dog after he's gone was just that lightning bolt out of nowhere. And I wish I knew where it came from because I'd like for it to strike again.
But I have to say I have some questions for you about some observations. We watched it last night, and I was just completely blown away. And I think I still might be sobbing. So let me ask you, the death of that family dog. This is probably an obvious and ridiculous question, but it's important. Like, I know the nucleus. Sure. We've talked about the nucleus, but that had to really shake you, right? The family dog, 15 years, and I love how, and I'm going to make some more observations, but I love how Hanks, in the movie really kind of doesn't like to call it his pet. I love the way he kind of humanizes the robot, the dog, because that's what it is. It's anybody who's ever owned a dog knows it's never about owning anything or he's my or she's my.
Right.
It's just two beings, you and your dog, and that's where I think that's one of the many things that really makes Finch work.
Right. And, that's certainly where that line came from about him saying he's not my dog, he's his own dog, and certainly that's something that becomes more apparent in that larger confessional speech near the end of the movie. But it's exactly that. It was my inability to be able to say goodbye to my dog at the time in person was a huge deal. And, even today, it was like, I still think sometimes, could I have made a different decision? Maybe I could have done that, but obviously it was still would have been a heartbreak nonetheless. And I remember I remember watching Tarantino on the Charlie Rose show, and he was talking about how your life at the time affects what you're doing. And it was him talking about where like the quarter pounder with cheese came from in Pulp Fiction. And that was because he was in Amsterdam writing Pulp Fiction. And, it was that clash of cultures where he was like, well, I know it as a quarter pounder with cheese, but they call it a Royale with cheese. And, it found its way into the script. And now it's this really iconic scene. And he was talking about, he used the analogy of an actor who's working on Broadway. And he said, if I'm driving to that performance that night and I hit a dog, that's going to affect me as a person. And therefore that's going to affect my performance that evening. It's just undeniable, because if it doesn't, why are you there? And it in a very, unconscious way at the time, but only am I seeing that upon reflection. That's exactly what was happening with the development of this short story for me. It was like it wasn't something I was necessarily conscious of until after it had been written, that, this must have come from the fact that I was never given the opportunity to say goodbye properly, as far as I'm concerned. And obviously, this came from the exposure I was having to The Road or Fallout 3 or whatever else I was marinating in at the time. And it sometimes, those ideas just like literally come out of nowhere, and often I think it's knowing when to listen to those or when to phase them out is whenever I've sort of come out of writing a scene and thinking to myself, okay, that's really working. It's just being able to listen to whatever ideas come flooding to you. And this is a prime example, just to cut forward ever so slightly. I remember thinking between Ivor and I, okay, we know we need to get them out of the underground bunker, because the short film, that's all it was. It was all entirely underground. And it was, the last scene of the short script was the droid, as he was known in the short script, carrying the old man, as he was known in the short script, out of the bunker. And then the droid returning, and then obviously it's just the two of them, the dog and the droid, live happily ever after together. So what we knew was that we couldn't stretch that out into a 2-hour movie. We knew we didn't want to make a contained drama. We knew we wanted to see outside the window because it's a feature film, and so that's, there needs to be some sense of adventure there. So then it became that issue of, well, why would they leave? Why would they leave this very safe haven? And why would they go out into this very, harsh world? And then it was at 4:30 one morning. I literally sat upright in bed, and I remember it so clearly, almost like it was yesterday. And I pulled out my laptop and immediately emailed Ivor this very lengthy description of this idea that I just had. And basically the short story is it was the RV. It was the Winnebago, as it was written. That's what gets them out of the front door. It's the bunker on wheels, and they're doing it because not only do they have this huge storm that's going to potentially bury them, and therefore they would run out of their food supplies so quickly, but it's also a very neat way of Finch showing Jeff the realities of the world as it is now. It's like opening your eyes to the way things are now and how things are now, because his head is only filled of information pre-apocalypse, right? So he's almost like he has no idea unless Finch either tells him or shows him. And obviously this is a film, so he shows him. But it was that discovery of the RV that allowed them to leave the bunker in the most logical way I could possibly muster. And again, it's one of those just weird ideas that just come out of complete left field, I always had obsession with RVs as a kid, and my parents would go to very great lengths into telling you about it almost being somewhat of a worrying obsession with them. But somewhere in my subconscious, obviously that was there, and it was waiting to be found, I suppose.
So I know you seek out Ivor. You guys clearly have a good rapport with each other, but are you protective in any way of like so Bios and Finch, that's not to be over the top. That's your baby, right? That's what you've really put your life into. So granted, you trust him. He's gone out of his way to really help you. He sounds like a good man, a good friend. Yep. However, you've got to be protective, right? Because a lot of the nucleus of this is personal for you, the family dog, other things. So right. So you must be a bit protective of that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And the one thing that I would say is that what made this whole concept work was that predicament, that dynamic. And so the very things that I held very near and dear were already sold. I didn't need to ever fight with Ivor about keeping any of that and being precious about any of that, because from the point that I brought it to him, all the conversations were just, well, where do they go beyond this and why? So whilst it was a character that I had already written in that sense, it became something else entirely, which is to say I always kept that core, that nucleus of how it started. But then once we got them out the front door in the most logical way possible, then it was everything else beyond that was like, well, what do they do and why do they do it? And so that's where between us, we came this really good tag team. Because Ivor is, he's going to kill me for this if he hears it, but I believe Ivor is in his mid-70s, 75, and I'm 32. So between us, we had this really awesome, and still continue to have this really awesome dynamic between us, because, you know, we're obviously able to share different life experiences from different generations, and, you know, we sort of come together and meet in the middle, and that's kind of how we wrote too.
Works really well that way.
Really well,
yeah.
Surprisingly well. Yeah. We never wrote in the same room, you know, even though we lived only 20 minutes apart for the whole time we were writing it. It was just this way of, you know, someone does the first pass on a scene, and then the other person goes over that, puts their voice into it, and it's a back and forth until suddenly it's like, right, this is working. It's time to move on.
Yeah.
And that's the way the entire script was written. Obviously, we sort of road mapped everything out first, and we did everything on the good old index card. But it's very rough. You know, it was almost like planning the actual road trip.
Right.
You know, literally cracking out a map and just being like, okay, they're starting here, they're heading there. They're going to see this on the way. Potentially, they're going to go through Utah and the Salt Plains, and, you know, it sort of takes on that very sort of logical trip. But then it becomes all about, well, what's important for the story? You know, what are we trying to say here? If they're stopping here, why? You know. And
let me ask you. So you were talking earlier about how this film came to be, which is such an impressive journey in itself. But I also want to add, so it goes, and this is I'm making a long story short here. It goes from Ivor to Miguel, then it gets handed off to Image Movers, which is Robert Zemeckis' company. Then indirectly that goes to Spielberg, which leads to Tom Hanks, right? So is that, yes. Do I have okay, so let me ask
Almost.
you. Okay, what am I missing on that?
Not to sidetrack too completely, but obviously it took me a long time to be able to say to myself, I need to surrender this script as something that I'm going to direct myself, right?
Right.
And it took me a long time to get to that point, because
that gets us back to that how much this means to you, right? The earlier question,
right?
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was almost like for a long time, I think Evil was probably, you know, wetting the bed at some points, thinking, "Oh my God, this guy's gonna drive this thing into the ground just through sheer stubbornness." But it took, it's that idea of, well, this was the whole point I wrote it, was for me to again prove myself, you know. But I just reminded myself of that old saying of, it's better to be 50% of something than 100% of nothing, you know, and that's what it was ultimately going to be. Because even though I had some very early potential success with some early conversations about directing this thing, obviously this thing always wanted to be much bigger than I could ever allow it to be as the director. So then very quickly it became this process of, well, if it's really not going to be me, then who should it be? And obviously, poetically, of course, it's going to be Miguel. You know, unfortunately for us, he really liked the script, and obviously he had that utmost confidence with Ivor because of their relationship that was twice as long as the relationship that I had with Ivor at the time, and so, you know, it all just sort of made sense. And then after he came on board, not long after, he had obviously won the Emmy for his Game of Thrones episode, the Battle of the Bastards episode, rightly so.
Oh, so good.
It's so good. And then obviously there was a lot of knocking at the door. What would you like to do next? You know, and obviously I'm paraphrasing as much as I know, but he basically put our script into people's hands, and it was through Robert Zemeckis' company. That was off. There was a number of stops along the way, don't get me wrong, but Image Movers were just the right place for this movie, you know.
For sure.
And it was through them that we obviously were fielding the questions of, well, who do we see in this role? And there was a very short list, you know, because we really did need someone to be able to hold this movie by themselves and also be extremely relatable. And obviously when you start ticking all those boxes, there are very few people left on the planet that can fill that. And obviously Tom Hanks was right at the top of that list. But I was talking to someone the other day saying that I never wrote this movie with anyone in mind, let alone someone like Tom Hanks, because why would you? It's like pie in the sky stuff,
Right.
But through the sheer power of who Robert Zemeckis is and the films that he and Tom had done before, it was, I want to say it was 24 hours between us getting the script to Tom and him saying he wants to sit down with Miguel and basically saying to Miguel, I want to be in this. What else can I do? It's funny because this industry either moves at 100 miles an hour or it moves in reverse. There's almost like there's no
in between.
It's like you either feel like the world has stopped turning or it's moving so fast you can't keep up. And this movie was no exception to that in terms of the way it happened. And after that, it was, okay, we have a script, we have Tom Hanks, we have a director, we have a budget in place. It's a package deal. Let's go out right now. And then we didn't. We sat on it for a year. This was, and I was going to work the day that I found out about Tom coming on board. I just pulled up into a multi-story car park to start a very long day on a film called Holmes and Watson.
Okay,
and I'd seen like this chain of emails from the evening before because of obviously the time delay, and it was like, okay, Tom's going to be in the movie, and I just sort of had to sit there for a while and compose myself and be like, that's going on there, but I'm here to do a job, and I always, I wanted to conduct myself as I had been right up to every day, very professionally. I'm there to do a very particular job, and then that's it. So very few people knew about what I was working on, and certainly what was happening with the screenplay as well.
But your baby is not. But your baby, Finch Weinberg, the character that you've known forever, right? He's been more familiar to you than ever, is now being portrayed. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around the magnitude of this, by who is essentially probably the best actor, in my opinion, of all time.
Yep,
I mean,
I agree.
It's how do you even normalize that? Like you said, you sat on it, you kind of had to think about it. I think I would be just soaked into a couch and just have to think about that. Like that's pretty amazing stuff.
It took me a long time to get out of the car, and I think the only reason I did was because I realized I was very hungry and I was running out of time to eat before call. So then it was kind of like just staring at a plate of beige food for a while and just thinking to myself, it did take a long time, and it was even today, even speaking to you right now, it's still, I can't quite believe it myself, because again, this is an actor who I have admired and watched for so long, so long. And I think my first exposure to him was Big. And that was one of my childhood favorite movies. And so the idea that I would ever write a screenplay that was good enough that he would turn around to and say, yeah, I want to be in this, it's just unbelievable. Even today, it's just, I still have to, remind myself that it was him that said yes. But the reason, just to tie a neat bow on what I was saying, the reason we sat on it between him saying yes to us and us going out to the industry with it as a package was because we wanted to clear Miguel's schedule at the time. He was wrapped up with season 8, I believe, maybe a little bit earlier. I'm not sure. His commitments to that particular season that he was doing at the time. So we knew we needed to get past that before we went out, because the last thing that we wanted to do was sell the movie and then sit on it, because then it's kind of like you can't help but want to start noodling with stuff. And we just wanted to sell it and then immediately go and start production. And that's what we did. So it was a big moment though, because obviously we were going to be asking the biggest star in the world to delay, to be like, are you okay waiting for us? And fortunately for all of us, he said, absolutely, I'm more than happy to.
Jesus.
Wait.
Wow.
Yeah. Really, really amazing. It's
And he brings that the power, and just to get into the movie a little bit here, the power that only Hanks can bring to Finch, right? The love he has for Goodyear, and certainly by the end of the movie, Jeff, that he would, he has a line in the movie, and I'm going to massacre it, but it was almost Dickens-esque, right? It was very much like, if I had to live, if I could, something about living the years and, the ghost of Christmas.
Do something different with the time he had.
Yes, and I think Goodyear helps him find the value in life. I think he helps him find, so his whole journey for those listening, just being able to make sure he's cared for, right? And it gets me thinking, like, here I am doing research on your life, and I'm looking at this story, and I'm getting teared up again, because I feel like as much as I love the movie, I found myself thinking about it all day today.
Really? Wow.
Oh yeah, and it's the impact, right? Because, I have 3 dogs, and you went through, I have yet to go through what you went through as, having that family dog pass. But it got me thinking, right, that just the rapport Hanks with this dog, I'm telling you, Craig, I'm embarrassed to say it, like, I was pouring, like, and even making my notes today, I was like, it got me thinking about my rapport, because you think about, we don't go towards animals, but like, we're getting back to the point of viewing something as a being, right? My dog Bear has been through the birth of my daughter, the loss of my dad. Like,
amazing.
He's been through so watching Finch brings all that back. It's a very special movie.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's exactly the genesis of the whole thing for me. It's that idea of, okay, if I want to write a science fiction film, how can I make it less science fiction as possible? That idea of, that's why we never get too involved in terms of the world. How did it end and what did it go through to end? One thing that we were incredibly conscious of was we didn't want to reinvent the post-apocalyptic wheel, which is why it feels, in terms of the world outside the window, it feels familiar in terms of what we've seen from post-apocalyptic films, because by world building, that means you're inventing, and by inventing, that means you're having to explain, and by explaining, that means you're eating into your running time. And so it was a very, very, very conscious decision to make sure this is as simple and as relatable as a post-apocalyptic film as it could be, because by doing that, that means we can get past it very quickly and get into what we wanted to get into, which is the humanity of it, the human predicament of this man at the end of the world having to make these decisions. And it was in focusing on that we also realized very quickly we don't need a B plot line or a C plot line and etc. We don't need a typical villain other than the danger and the hazards of the environment. And everything that happens to them is all in service of the characters, all of it, because that's ultimately what the movie is about, is the characters. And a prime example of that is the moment where we do have a small flavor of, there is someone else here, and there's that car tailing them. That never came from a place of, okay, we need an action scene here to keep up with it. No, it came from a place of, right, we want to get Finch to a point where he has to make this confessional. And how do we get him there? Well, we push him there emotionally, and we get him there through almost having to go back to this thing that was very painful for him, which was obviously that that moment where he realized that he wasn't able, he was completely helpless in that scenario, but he took that as a way of thinking, I'm a coward. But coupling that and the final blow to that scene is obviously how he discovered Goodyear as well, and why Goodyear is so important to him. So all of that to say, every decision that's made throughout this movie is in service to the characters, which is why I feel like it's very introspective as a movie. This isn't, if you're looking for a movie that's got back-to-back and wall-to-wall action, this isn't it, But if you want a movie that you feel like you can relate to, even if you're not a science fiction fan, which my grandparents certainly aren't, but they're dog lovers, right? Then you'll get it, because there's just an undeniable humanity about it, and it's actually something that I've discovered is kind of like my writing algorithm, I would say, which is sort of taking very, very big genre, high concept ideas, but then just coupling it with the most independent heart, spirit, and soul that I could find, which is, just the most relatable of human acts. In this case, it was a man just trying to look after his dog. So it's amazing how all of those things can go into a melting pot sometimes and find their way out again. But one thing that I'm eternally proud of with this particular film is that where it started, which was, in my bedroom at third year in film school, and the values and themes that it held at its center continued all the way through the very different, many iterations with different potential outlets along the way, all the way up to making this movie as a studio movie with Amblin and Image Movers and Tom Hanks with Miguel Sapochnik directing. It kept that all the way through. And that's something that I'm eternally proud and grateful for, because it's almost like that the two things shouldn't go together. It was always that this movie started out as that very small independent movie, and then it became something much bigger, but it just never let us go in terms of keeping that so close and making that the most important thing.
Yeah, and it has such a huge heart, and I was not ready for that. I mean, I expected a great movie. I just was not ready for the rapport, not only with Goodyear and Finch, but with Jeff as well. And I also like how it kept it real with Finch's disappointment in humanity, right? And I love that. I love where you could still tell a great story. You could still be emotional when it needs to be, but also be very honest and be very truthful. And I love that part of this movie.
Thank you. It was certainly a deliberate effort, to make that as real as possible, which is why Finch even contradicts himself a lot of times, which, you don't see in your typical movie heroes when they state something that is the way and that's it. There's nothing else. But here he sort of goes back on what he said. The idea of, trust being one of the major themes of the film, right? So the idea that at one point he scolds Jeff for not being able to trust anyone, trust no one. But then at the end, him saying, trust me, it's that conflict, that human element that arrested me in terms of the development of this. And that certainly that came through in writing and rewriting it and discovering that, actually this is a father and son dynamic. It's Jeff is going from toddler to teenager by the end, and what that journey is and how that all sort of reflects on itself. And therefore, well, what does this movie actually, what is its message? What is it saying? But more importantly, and hopefully it never beats itself over anyone's heads. It's just, if you want to see that, it's there.
Yeah. And two quick questions before I let you go. You give me all this time. I can't thank you enough.
That's okay.
Yeah, I was just so taken back and enamored by this. I don't want to sound repetitive, but the movie made my year, and I can't thank you enough for that.
Thank you. I'm really touched. Thank you.
Kudos to Caleb Landry Jones, who plays Jeff.
Oh, yeah.
Hanks was on Kimmel, and he was shouting the praises of so many people, and he did such a great job promoting this film. And Seamus, who plays Goodyear, what a wonderful dog. And I've been after this guy forever. Joe Williams and his phenomenal cinematography, which is like you could have turned the volume off on this movie and just watched the way it looked. Like it was just so stunning. And I mean, we've mentioned so many people involved, including yourself, but I felt those three in particular just really wonderful job.
I couldn't agree more. I from talking about Caleb for just 1 second, absolutely, because he was in every single scene, right opposite Tom in every single scene. Some people will think that he just lent his voice. Absolutely not. It's him in a suit with motion tracking dots on it, and literally acting opposite Tom. And so there's, the whole film was shot like a low budget in terms of, the way it was staged. Like an independent family drama, it had that sort of rapport to it. That's part of what kept it so real. And it was only later that the CGI puppet was put on top of him and his performance. And, everything from the only thing that remains is his hands and the bottom of his feet, the two surfaces that interact with everything and the environment around him. And then Seamus, absolutely could not agree more. Again, something else that I'm really proud of is the fact that Seamus was a rescue dog.
Wow, I didn't know. That is fantastic.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm always touched, even just hearing that story, that, it was because he went through so much as well before. He went through some pretty life-threatening situations in terms of his health and what was happening to him. And people didn't think he was going to pull through, and he did. And not only did he pull through, he ended up becoming the hero dog on this movie. And such a hero he is that the other two dogs that, you would sort of use as relief, so, give him a break, we never used, because he was just so ready and willing and able and amazing at what he was doing, which was just being a dog. Because more often than not, when I see dogs on screen, they're performing and they're doing tricks and they're doing that. Seamus was just perfect at being a real dog on camera.
Jesus.
So I couldn't agree more. And then obviously, Willems with his cinematography, absolutely could not agree more with that as well. And in fact, I went on Twitter the other day and saw that some people that had been watching the movie and obviously had been picking up on the same things you did, had sort of put together this collage of different stills from the movie. And it made me sort of take two steps back and think, oh my God, it's seeing, these the yellows of the sand and then the blue of the sky, and, the way maybe I think there was a still of the lightning bolt behind Jeff in the underpass. And just seeing those stills put together as that sort of collage. Yeah, I mean, it was very powerful to see the just the power of the still, put together like that, and seeing the visual tapestry of the film. I'm just hand on heart. I'm so grateful to everyone involved with the making of this film, because it literally made a dream come true for me.
In the little things, one of the biggest little things that I love the most is even like the evolution of Jeff's voice, right? Because in a way, he starts off almost sounding like Borat in a way.
Yeah, right.
And then he makes his way to, as all our voices change, both, physically and, as we get older and as we find our voice, right? To steal from the King's Speech, it's just the way it progresses. I thought the little things this movie does really make it go,
That was a written thing. It wasn't necessarily we wrote the accent. That was all Caleb.
Right.
100% him. But it was written as this very sort of stunted English to begin with, and then far more fluent come the end. And it was just something that we thought, well, that kind of shows the development and evolution of his sentience without going into the nitty gritty of that, because unfortunately we just don't have time. And I'd have to rewatch the movie, but certainly in the script, I was very conscious of not referring, like Jeff never referring to himself as I. It was never I. It was always, in like almost like the third person. Never knew that he was a physical entity. And obviously there was that lovely scene which wasn't written actually, which is when Jeff sees his reflection for the first time.
That's great in the hospital.
Yeah,
great.
Just this moment where he sort of sees himself, and it was right before the popcorn moment.
It's the cinema, not the hospital. The cinema. Yes.
And just there was a longer cut at one point, and he moves his shoulders left and right, and he's looking down at himself, and those sort of those moments, I suppose, all came from that idea of, well, how do we show the evolution of his sentience without getting too lost in it? Because obviously you can make an entire movie about that in itself. But his voice, certainly, and obviously what Caleb brought to it was this very heavy Slavic accent going into his his normal dialect every day, which is this sort of Texas drawl slightly.
I loved it.
Yeah. It's sort of it's one of those things that some people will hear straight away, others will see maybe on a second viewing or something. But again, it was just that very slight way of just saying, well, maybe we can play with this to to make him more human come the end.
Lastly, Craig, if you look at this, obviously this has been a big part of your life. Is there a scene that hit you hardest or meant the most to you where you're like, oh my gosh, this started in film school, this scene, and it kind of made its way. And when you finally saw it on the screen, you were kind of blown back by. Is there a moment like that for you, or is it the entire movie like that for you, or both?
The scene that I most like is obviously is Finch's confessional scene. I'm always really proud of that. I love the moment when they're around the campfire under the Aurora Borealis, and he talks about emotion. Oh. But there's just it in the grand scheme of things, it's incredibly disposable. But to answer your question most specifically, there is a line that existed right from the very first draft of the short script that has existed all the way through to the final film, and it's very disposable. But it's that moment where he right at the beginning, he spoons out the can of dog food, he puts the bowl down, he's drinking, and the dog's just sat there looking at him, and he waits until he says, "Don't worry about me, you carry on." And that moment, that line existed right from the very first thing I ever put pen to paper to, and there it is in the final film. And it that only dawned on me the other day that through everything that's still in there. That was kind of a funny moment.
That's awesome, and so are you. What lies ahead for you, Craig? What's around the corner? Are there future projects? I mean, I hope this opens up some big doors for you, some deserving doors for you. What can you say about what's ahead for you? What's coming up? Anything you'd like to throw out there?
There's a number of things that I'm working on. Some are obviously still within the science fiction space because I love it so much. Some are in the non-fiction space, which I also, it's new to me, and I'm really enjoying that. And continuing to work on that original material. So, not quite sure what the next thing is, but there's a couple of, I've got a TV show of my own creation that I'm developing at the moment, and also a time travel spec script. So if Finch was my answer to a post-apocalyptic film, this is certainly going to be my answer to a time travel film.
It was so great having you on today, and thank you so much for your work and your kindness.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Derek Thomas and Monday Morning Critic Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also connect with Monday Morning Critic on Instagram and Facebook, MDM Critic on Twitter, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are found. All episodes available, www.mmcpodcast.com.